Before starting the story, please like and subscribe the channel. Okay, let's dive into the story. I've been working at a small local restaurant for about 6 months now. It's tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The owners, an older couple named Mr. and Mrs. Hargrave, have run the place for decades. They're nice enough, but there's always been something a little off about them. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at me every time I walked through the door. From the start, there were rules, strange ones. Not just the typical wash your hands or don't be late kind of rules, but more specific, almost ritualistic ones. The first time Mrs. Hargrave handed me the employee handbook, I remember flipping through the pages, my brow furrowing with every line I read. Rule number 1, the front door must always be locked after 9 p.m., no exceptions. Rule number 2, never serve table 6 after 8 p.m., even if the patrons insist. Rule number 3, if you hear footsteps in the back hall after closing, ignore them. Rule number 4, the kitchen lights must stay on until the last employee has left. I had laughed nervously when I first read them, thinking it was some kind of hazing for new employees. But Mrs. Hargrave's expression was dead serious as she handed me the key to the back door. "These rules aren't a joke," she said, her voice firm. "They've kept this place running smoothly for years. Just follow them, and you'll be fine." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept into my gut. As the weeks went by, I learned to follow the rules without question. The door was always locked by 9, no matter what. I never so much as glanced at table 6 after 8 o'clock. And when I heard those inexplicable footsteps echoing down the back hall, I forced myself to focus on cleaning, pretending I was alone. But it was the kitchen lights that bothered me the most. The way they would flicker as I left, as though they were alive, as though they were watching. And sometimes I swore I could feel something, someone watching me as I walked out the door, but never mentioned it to anyone. After all, everyone else seemed to act like it was just another day at work. They never spoke of the rules, never questioned them, and so neither did I. It wasn't until my 3rd month there that things started to change. The first sign was small, almost insignificant. I was finishing up a late shift when I noticed that the lights in the kitchen had been turned off. I frowned, thinking that I must have forgotten to leave them on, but I distinctly remembered flicking the switch before I left the room. Shaking it off as a simple mistake, turned them back on and headed home. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was certain I hadn't turned them off. I made sure to leave them on, even double-checked before locking up. But when I walked back through the dining area, the kitchen was plunged into darkness once more. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the light switch, my hands trembling. Something wasn't right. And then, the whispers started. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Just the wind, or the creaks of an old building settling at night. But the whispers were real. They started softly, barely audible over the hum of the kitchen appliances. I couldn't make out any words, just a low hissing sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It happened the same way each night, right after I locked the front door. By the time I reached the kitchen, the whispers were there, waiting for me. I tried to ignore them, pushing down the rising sense of dread that churned in my stomach. But it became harder and harder to pretend everything was normal, especially when I started to notice the way the others would look at me. Sideways glances, furtive looks exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. It was as if they were waiting for something they knew was inevitable but didn't dare to speak of. One night I stayed late to finish inventory. It was well past 9, and the restaurant was deserted, the silence thick and oppressive. I had just locked the front door, as per the rules, and was making my way toward the back when the whispers returned, louder than before, almost frantic. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment I considered running out the back door and not looking back, but I couldn't. I needed this job, and I knew if I broke one of the rules, there would be consequences. So I did what I always did, ignored the whispers, hurried through my tasks, and flicked the kitchen lights back on when they inevitably switched off on their own. But as I headed toward the exit, something caught my eye, a shadow darker than the rest, lurking in the corner of the dining room. It was just for a split second, but I knew I saw it. I turned quickly, my eyes searching the dimly lit room, but there was nothing there. The shadow was gone. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a product of my exhausted mind, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something was in the restaurant with me, and it was getting bolder. The next day I decided to confront Mrs. Hargrave. I couldn't keep going on like this, pretending nothing was wrong. I needed answers. I found her in the back office going over some paperwork. "Mrs. Hargrave," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've noticed some strange things happening here at night. The lights, the whispers. I even thought I saw something last night. A shadow or..." She looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "You saw something?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. I hesitated, realizing too late that I had crossed a line. I'm not sure. It was probably just my imagination." For a long moment she stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed and set down her pen. "I told you to follow the rules, didn't I? That's all you need to do. Don't worry about anything else. Just do your job and everything will be fine." "But everything will be fine," she repeated, cutting me off. There was an edge to her voice now, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Trust me." I nodded, though the pit in my stomach only deepened. There was something in Mrs. Hargrave's eyes, something that told me she knew more than she was letting on. But I didn't push it. I returned to my duties, though the unease lingered, gnawing at me with every passing day. As the weeks went by, the strange occurrences only intensified. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadow, whatever it was, began to show up more frequently, always in the same spot, just out of the corner of my eye. The others continued to act as though nothing was wrong, but I could see the tension in their faces, the way their eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen whenever they thought no one was looking. One night, after a particularly long shift, I found myself alone in the dining room, cleaning up after the last table had left. The clock on the wall read 8:45 p.m., and the place was eerily quiet. I was wiping down the tables when I noticed that table 6 still had its chairs arranged as if it had just been used. That was impossible. No one had sat there all night. A chill ran down my spine. I walked over slowly, my heart pounding. The table was pristine, as though someone had just set it for the evening. The silverware was polished, the napkins folded neatly, and a single candle sat in the center, unlit. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the candle. But before I could, I heard it. The footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing second, coming from the back hall. I stood frozen, my mind racing. The rules flashed through my head. If you hear footsteps in the back hall after closing, ignore them. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew closer, heavier, until they sounded as though they were right behind me. I could feel the air shift, a cold breeze brushing the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see someone or something standing there. But the hall was empty. The whispers started up again, louder than ever, swirling around me like a thick fog. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, their words still unintelligible but filled with a sense of urgency. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I needed to get out, needed to leave before whatever was in the restaurant decided to reveal itself. But as I reached for the back door, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it remained stubbornly shut, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. I slammed my fists against the door, desperate to escape. But it was no use. The whispers were growing louder, angrier, and I could feel the shadow closing in on me, pressing in from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the footsteps ceased, and the door swung open with a loud creak. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street. I didn't go back to work the next day, or the day after that. I couldn't. Every time I thought about returning, I felt that cold dread creeping back in, that sensation of being watched, of something unseen lurking just out of sight. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I needed the job, and more importantly, I needed answers. After a week of restless nights and unanswered questions, I finally worked up the courage to return. When I walked through the doors, the familiar scent of the restaurant greeted me, but it felt different, more oppressive. The other employees greeted me with nods, but I could see the relief in their eyes, as if they had been expecting something far worse to happen in my absence. That night, as the clock ticked closer to closing time, I decided to break one of the rules. I needed to know what was going on, and the only way to find out was to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. At 8 p.m., when I should have been clearing the last of the tables, I instead sat down at table 6. My hands trembled as I set the candle in the center and struck a match. The tiny flame flickered weakly before casting long shadows across the room. I could feel the tension in the air, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. For a long moment, nothing did. The restaurant remained silent, the whispers absent, the footsteps nowhere to be heard. I began to wonder if I had imagined everything, if the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. But just as I was about to blow out the candle, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I felt it, that presence hovering just out of sight. The whispers returned, louder and clearer than ever. This time they weren't just hissing sounds. They were words sharp and insistent, though I couldn't understand them. My heart raced as I strained to make out what they were saying, but it was as if they were speaking in a language I didn't know. And then, without warning, the candle's flame went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for light, but before I could turn on the flashlight, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I jerked away, my breath catching in my throat. When I finally managed to turn on the light, I saw nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been moments before, but the air was thick with a sense of dread, as if the very darkness itself was alive, watching, waiting. My phone buzzed in my hand, the sudden vibration startling me. It was a text from Mrs. Hargrave. "Leave now," it read, "before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door, my pulse racing. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were louder, closer, echoing through the empty restaurant like a drumbeat. I turned, my eyes wide with fear, and saw the shadow no longer content to lurk in the corners. It was moving toward me slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I had broken the rules and was coming to collect its due. My hand shook as I fumbled with the lock, the footsteps growing louder with each passing second. I could feel the shadow closing in, the air around me growing colder, thicker. And then, just as I thought I wouldn't make it, the door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, the restaurant now a distant memory. But even then, I could feel it, that presence, lingering just out of sight, watching me, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. When I finally caught my breath, I pulled out my phone and texted Mrs. Hargrave. "What is it?" I typed, my fingers trembling. "What's in the restaurant?" Her reply was almost instant, and it sent a chill down my spine. "It's been here longer than we have," she wrote. "It's why the rules exist. You must follow them, or it will follow you." I stared at the message, my mind racing. Mrs. Hargrave's words left me shaken. Whatever was in that restaurant wasn't just some ghost or trick of the mind. It was something older, something far more sinister. But what was it? And why had the Hargraves allowed it to remain for so long? I couldn't go back, not yet. I needed answers first. I spent the next few days researching the restaurant, digging into old records, newspaper archives, anything that might shed some light on the place's dark history. What I found was unsettling. The building had been around for over a century, originally a boarding house that had gained a reputation for strange disappearances in the late 1800s. Residents would check in, only to vanish without a trace. The local authorities investigated but found nothing. No bodies, no signs of foul play, just empty rooms and the occasional report of strange noises and shadows. The boarding house was eventually shut down, abandoned for years before being renovated and reopened as a restaurant. But the strange occurrences continued. Patrons and employees alike reported the same things. Whispers, footsteps, the inexplicable cold. There were even a few more disappearances, though they were often written off as runaways or people who simply left town without a word. And then the Hargraves bought the place. I felt a pit form in my stomach as I read through the articles. The same patterns, the same reports, repeating over and over through the years. And the Hargraves had known about it all along. They hadn't just ignored the restaurant's dark history, they had embraced it, creating the rules to keep whatever was inside at bay. But why? Why keep the place open, knowing the risks? The answer came to me in a cold, terrifying realization. They weren't trying to contain it. They were feeding it. The rules weren't there to protect us. They were there to protect the entity, to ensure it stayed strong and hungry, never going too long without a taste of fear, or worse. By following the rules, we were playing into its hands, keeping it satisfied so it wouldn't lash out and take more than it needed. And those who broke the rules, they were the sacrifices. My blood ran cold as I pieced it together. The Hargraves had made a deal long ago to keep the restaurant thriving in exchange for providing a steady supply of fear and occasionally a life. I was just the latest pawn in their twisted game. I couldn't go back, not now, not ever. But as I sat in my apartment trying to figure out my next move, I felt that familiar chill creep over me again. The air grew thick, and the shadows in the corners of my room seemed to shift, to move closer. My phone buzzed on the table, and with trembling hands I picked it up. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. "You broke the rules." I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew then that it didn't matter if I went back to the restaurant or not. It didn't matter where I went, how far I ran. It was too late. The entity had already marked me. I had played the game and lost, and now the entity was coming to collect.